This is Phil Kopman with a tutorial on security threats. The topic of security threats includes issues such as: what is the motivation for attacking you or your system? How sophisticated are the attackers? Are they likely to have access to tool support, and so on? And what is your operational environment? How can they compromise confidentiality, integrity, and availability properties for your particular system? Anti-patterns for security threats include assuming unsophisticated attacks, ignoring operational environment changes, and ignoring threats from the equipment owner who's attempting to subvert the system that they own. One of the considerations in establishing a security posture is asking the question, why would someone attack my system? Unfortunately, the motivations for attack are much broader than sometimes considered. At the top of the list are nation-state attacks. These are countries or other equivalently resourced groups which are attacking systems for agendas such as disrupting geopolitical areas, retaliation, espionage, preparing for future conflict, and theft of intellectual property. However, governments are not the only highly capable attackers. There are well-resourced criminal groups who also launch wide-scale attacks. For them, it's typically all about the money. They launch ransomware attacks, denial of service attacks for extortion, and so on. There's even a robust economy for launching attacks as a service. That means you can rent out a fleet of bots to attack a target, and the people running the system aren't interested in who gets attacked. They're just interested in collecting money to let someone else launch an attack. They sell access to the bad guys. This even propagates to the degree that players of online games have been known to rent fleets of attack services just to compromise an opponent in the online game. Another motivation for attack, which confounds much security planning, is some people attack just for fun. They want fame, publicity, notoriety, revenge, things that are non-monetary and non-geopolitical. When considering the wide profile of motivations, it's difficult to justify not worrying about security using the excuse, well, why would anyone bother to attack us? The bad news is that sometimes the reason you get attacked is simply that your company or system is at the wrong place at the wrong time for someone who's bored and decides to pick on your system to attack simply because they can. Another dimension of security threats is the level of capability and sophistication of the attacker. Once someone has decided to attack you, the question is, what kind of resources and what kind of energy are they willing to put into it? They range across the following spectrum. A casual abuser might try a default password, 1234, etc., and give up when they get bored. Slightly more sophisticated is a script kiddie. A script kiddie is a nickname for someone who is relatively unsophisticated but uses very sophisticated tools created by others. This is surprisingly common, and the issue is it gives a wide range of unsophisticated attackers the ability to launch near state-of-the-art attacks, exploiting known vulnerabilities. Think of it as a robust market for toolifying attacks. At the next level of sophistication is an organized group, a criminal group, or so-called hacktivists that are using sophisticated, clever attacks. Sometimes they break crypto or exploit known weaknesses in crypto, and they're willing to spend weeks or months on an attack. The issue is that these are highly sophisticated groups that may or may not have big resources, but can launch sophisticated, high-effort attacks for something they think is worth attacking. At the next level up are nation-states. These often are so-called advanced persistent threats. That means that they are highly capable and very patient. They might wait and look at a system and monitor it for months or even years, waiting for the one day where the firewall is disabled or the one day where some security breach can be done, and that is when they'll dive in. The existence of advanced persistent threats means that it's not okay to turn off your firewall for even 5 minutes at any point, because if one of them is trying to break in, that's the 5 minutes they will do it in. If you care about security, you need to assume that someone is always watching and waiting to break in. If you need to defend against an advanced persistent threat, that means you can never ever let your guard down, not even for a minute. Nation-states also have the resources to exploit unpublished vulnerabilities, marginal cryptographic approaches that require huge amounts of resources to exploit, and so on. They are willing to spend years and huge amounts of money on an attack for worthwhile targets. Another type of attacker that is of considerable importance for embedded systems is the system owner. Much of security assumes that the owner is not going to try and subvert their own system. In the desktop computing world, it's not typical for an owner to want to make their laptop computer insecure on purpose. However, in the embedded world, there can be secrets or capabilities that the system seller is trying to keep out of the hands of the owner, and the owner has incentive to subvert the system to break in and, for example, unlock features they have not paid for. Owners have complete physical access to at least one copy of the system. That means they can reverse engineer it to recover secrets, use side-channel attacks which monitor electromagnetic transmissions from the system or power consumption, and so on. Once an owner can get a copy of your system and have unconstrained access to it, they can do a lot more than can be done remotely via an internet-based attack. If you're building a system that you're putting in the hands of end users, you should assume that an attacker can find out any secrets that are built into a unit that they buy. The operational environment that your system is exposed to determines what types of threats you should consider. Ask yourself, how exposed are you to attack? Is your equipment likely to be directly connected to the internet? And by the way, if it has an Ethernet jack, someone will probably attempt to connect it to the internet even if you told them not to. Is your wireless network unencrypted? Can someone buy and reverse engineer your equipment? The easier it is for adversaries to reverse engineer your equipment or connect to it, the more exposed you are to attack. Ask yourself, what type of network connections are there? Even if you don't have Ethernet, there might be embedded networks, discrete I/O, user interfaces, and so on. And simply saying, well, we have a proprietary protocol has proven not to be particularly useful in resisting attacks. Ask yourself the degree to which you do data uploads and downloads. Do you do firmware updates or configuration file updates or maintenance log downloads? If so, the paths that are used to move those files back and forth are also potential arenas for attacks. They can be either direct attacks against the communication protocol stack, or they could be indirect attacks such as a malicious firmware update being sent to the system that is unwittingly installed by a user. Also, consider whether you use online updates or updates require manual access to the equipment. In general, the more difficult it is to change data inside a system, the less exposed you are to attack, simply as a matter of economics. If it's possible to automate an attack against all your systems, that gives you more exposure than an attack that requires a person to physically do something to each and every system that's being attacked. Finally, ask, do only trusted personnel have access to the equipment, or is it accessible by the owner? Or is it in a public place that anyone can access it anytime they like? Ask yourself if employees are incentivized to attack your system. Now that may seem odd, but taken in conjunction with whether security is seen as important or something that gets in the way, you may have a situation in which employees or authorized users are incentivized to subvert security, either to spend less time doing their job or to reduce the amount of effort it takes to complete some sort of transaction, as well as potentially trying to circumvent financial controls for their own gain. Historically, embedded system designers have often put forth naive assumptions about whether or not they can be attacked. A classic mistake is assuming that if you have a firewall, that you're safe from attack. The reality is that if it's connected to the internet directly or indirectly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's being subject to a constant bombardment of attacks, at least against the firewall, and some that probably get through. A worse issue is that in real-world deployments, it is common for firewalls to be bypassed or have features disabled that make them porous. A classic example of this was the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant being attacked by the slammer worm in 2003. The argument that the system was secure is that they had a firewall in place between the nuclear power plant internal network and the outside world. However, the way it got in is that a contractor had a remote computer that was logged into the inside of the firewall to make it easier to administer the system. The worm jumped from the contractor's site into the power plant and attacked unpatched systems inside the power plant, despite the fact that a patch against the slammer worm at that point had been available for 6 months. There are 2 takeaways here. One is keep your systems patched even though you think they're not subject to attack. And the second one is that just because you have a firewall does not mean that the firewall will always be effective. Another common misconception is that systems with wireless connectivity are considered to have low vulnerability to attack because someone would need to be physically very close to them to attack them. A common assumption is that a Bluetooth system can only be attacked by basically someone in the same room. While attacking Bluetooth at long range is uncommon, it absolutely can be done. Here's a picture of someone who built themselves a Bluetooth sniper rifle and was successful in connecting to a device in one of the office buildings in the background from more than a kilometer away. When considering types of threats, it is useful to revisit the concept of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability to see what particular threats might do to properties you care about. For integrity, the issue is whether or not the data is altered in a way that it's not supposed to be. A typical countermeasure for a threat against data integrity is to publish both the data and a digest of the data, and then the receiver checks the digest against the message to determine whether it's corrupted, whether from a malicious adversary or just by random noise. In some cases, systems have used checksums or CRCs to establish integrity. But the issue here is that those methods are insecure, even if it is a secret recipe for a checksum or a non-standard, non-published CRC polynomial. Those types of methods are readily attacked. Instead, a cryptographically secure integrity approach must be used to provide security. One approach is to use a message authentication code, which is a symmetric key cryptographic hash function with a shared key, and an alternate approach is a secure digital signature, which is based on asymmetric cryptography. Secure digital signatures are best if your system can support them, although a compromise can often be an asymmetric key encryption system used to distribute a message authentication code session key, with integrity being done within the session with that symmetric key hash algorithm. A related property that matters for embedded systems is authentication. You need to not only know that the message has not been tampered with, but also that the message comes from the source it's supposed to. That includes not only messages received from outside the system, but also messages sent within the system. For example, in an automobile, you would not want the infotainment system to forge messages and send them to the engine control system to accelerate the vehicle. That means you need authentication not only to the outside world, but also authentication between trusted versus non-trusted components on any critical functions within the system as well. One way to do authentication is to have a different key for integrity checks depending on the transmitter. Then the identity is implicit in which key is used. Note that if you use symmetric key approaches, such as a message authentication code, the receiver and the transmitter both have the key. Therefore, if there's a non-critical receiver of a critical message that knows the key, that receiver then has the capability to forge messages as if it were the transmitter. Using a public key infrastructure, PKI, provides identity, revocation, non-repudiation, and in general, all the properties you really want. A challenge in an embedded system is, within the system, you might not have access to a full PKI infrastructure that resides off-system. An authentication property that is sometimes important is non-repudiation. With non-repudiation, a signer is not able to say, "That wasn't me," if the PKI information associated with the transaction is archived. An example of non-repudiation in action would be keeping forensically valid logs of transactions. As a simple hypothetical example, if you receive a message from a traffic light and the traffic light says, "I'm green," but it wasn't and there's a crash, any car recording the message from the traffic light saying it's green would be able to say, yes, it sent that message even if the traffic light no longer had logs of that message. In other words, the traffic light would not be able to argue effectively that it did not send an erroneous message, even if the only record is in a receiver rather than the sender. Another aspect of security threats to consider is threats to confidentiality. One aspect of confidentiality is secrecy. Secrecy means that data cannot be understood by others, and typically secrecy is accomplished with encryption with an argument that the data can only be read by those who know the decryption key. With symmetric encryption, you have a shared key, which means that you need to trust the receiver to keep the secret key actually a secret. In a widely distributed embedded system, this can be an issue because while a central server might be trustworthy with a secret key, if every system in the fleet has the same secret key for receiving information, an attacker only needs to reverse engineer one system to retrieve the secret key and then be able to impersonate the central server. With asymmetric encryption, which is public plus private key pairs, a central server would have a private key used to encrypt information, and the individual systems would only have the public key to decrypt. In that case, reverse engineering one of the systems that's been sold only enables an adversary to receive information but not transmit it. With public key encryption, if you're concerned about whether or not the transmitter is authentic, if you have public key infrastructure, you can use that to establish the identity and authenticity of the central server doing the transmission. A property related to secrecy and confidentiality is privacy. Privacy is a little bit different than secrecy. For privacy, the contents of a message are not necessarily secret. What should be secret, though, is the association between that data and an individual or entity who sent the data. Encryption might only be a part of this. For example, an encrypted message that comes from one point to another might make the contents of the message secret, but might not make it secret who sent data to someone else. In telecommunications, there's the issue of metadata, such as which phone number called which other phone number. Even though the contents of the message might be entirely secret, just knowing who's talking to who can breach privacy. Another type of security threat to consider is a threat against availability. Availability generally has to do with whether services are available when they're desired. A classic compromise of availability is a denial of service attack, in which an attacker hits a system with so many requests that it overwhelms the system's resources and causes a loss of functionality for the intended user. This can be done by overloading the CPU, filling up memory with incomplete network transactions, or even draining a battery on a portable system simply by sending it a lot of messages that have to be processed. A sophisticated and very common form of denial of service is called a distributed denial of service attack, DDoS. That involves a coordinated attack from many different IP addresses, circumventing any defense which simply filters out IP addresses that are sending too much traffic. This is often accomplished using a botnet, in which fleets of so-called bots are leased by attackers as a service in order to take down a website or otherwise harass or take down some person or service that the attacker has an agenda against. A different flavor of availability attack is a feature activation attack. In this case, there's a pay-per-function embedded system, such as a television receiver that only has some channels enabled or has pay-per-view movies, or perhaps a navigation system for which you pay extra money to have more precise navigation. A feature activation attack gives you the ability to turn on unpaid features without paying for them. A related attack is that a vendor might have the ability to turn off features on cloned or counterfeit systems, and a feature activation attack would shield illicit systems from being turned off or having their functions shut down. Best practices for security threat for embedded systems include the following. Determine what parts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability you really care about. Do you really care about secrecy, or are you more worried about privacy? In most embedded systems, integrity is a core requirement, but there are different manifestations of that, and you should ask yourself which ones you care about. And ask yourself how much availability really matters. If you have a safety-critical system that is shut down, it might be that there's an economic loss, but no loss to safety. On the other hand, if you're building a system whose job is to monitor for safety issues in the outside world, a shutdown might result in the loss of safety for that system. It's generally a good idea to assume strong threats. Even relatively unsophisticated attackers can get access to tool support to launch sophisticated attacks, especially on publicly known vulnerabilities. Also, over time, systems tend to be networked. Systems that were designed with an assumption they would never be connected to the internet are increasingly being connected to the internet via some sort of network adapter so that they can be remotely managed and updated. That connection violates the security assumption of no network access and needs to be dealt with when attaching the system to the network to ensure security is still acceptable. Especially in embedded systems, it's important to remember the equipment owner might have not only the access, but the incentive to attack the system, to recover manufacturer secrets to use in attacking other systems, or to subvert a particular system to get some functionality they want, or to otherwise gain access to information or functionality that the manufacturer does not intend. The two biggest pitfalls for embedded system threat assessment are generally, first, assuming a naive, unmotivated attacker, and second, incorrectly emphasizing the use of encryption when the properties that really matter might much more deal with integrity and availability rather than just secrecy.